Hey guys, happy Saturday. Saturday, August the 10th. It's about 2:30 p.m. It's Tush coming at you. It's a beautiful day outside. We're not going to work on the TR3 today. We're just waiting for some paint to dry, or some epoxy to dry. And what we'll do is we'll do some work on the TR6 instead while we're waiting for that to dry. What we're going to do today is we'll take a little video of how to change out front disc brake pads and how to change or inspect the wheel bearings and repack them on this TR6. And first thing we want to do is take the road wheel off. I've just loosened the lug nuts while it's still on the ground. We'll get a jack on it and we'll lift it up and get that wheel off. Now, this is not necessarily what you should do. This is what I do. I'm not a licensed mechanic. As Steven Seagal said, I'm just a cook. Talk to you later. I will try to give you guys a rundown of the tools that I'm using as I go along and what materials I'm using as I go along. And just so you know, I'm also using, for reference, I've got the Haynes manual, and I've also got the Bentley manual here standing by for torque values and such. So I'm not flying blind. We're doing it by the book. All right, okay guys, road wheel's off, and the first thing we're going to do is remove the caliper. What you'll need for this is a 3/4 inch socket, and what I've got here is just a piece of wire. We're going to hang that caliper out of the way off of the upper control arms, just to get it out of the way while we get the hub off. So that's the first step. Remove those 2 bolts from the back of the caliper, and we'll hang the caliper just to get it out of the way. I'm not going to disconnect the brake lines. I don't want to have to re-bleed the brakes. So that'll be the first step. All right, guys. Okay, guys. Caliper is off and hanging at the back. What we're going to do is we're going to turn the wheel back so we get this straight on, and we'll continue to remove the grease cap, and we'll get the hub off. All right. So once you get the grease cap off, you're going to find a cotter pin and a castle nut. So you're going to remove the cotter pin, and you're going to loosen off the castle nut. Remove the castle nut and the D-washer underneath the castle nut, and then we'll go from there. I should mention, to get the castle nut off, you're using a 13/16 socket to get the castle nut off. So we'll do that now. So remove the D-washer and the castle nut, and that leaves the outer bearing visible. Sometimes to get the D-washer off, you need to pull the hub towards you, and that will bring it a little bit closer to you and grab it with your fingers. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the outer bearing, and then we're going to pull the hub, and we'll see what it looks like. I'd always mention, try to work clean. Try not to get any grease spread around, particularly on the rotor surface. I am going to clean these up with a degreaser after, but just makes it a little easier if you're a little bit careful. I'm wearing gloves. I've got a roll of paper towels handy, so I'm constantly wiping my hands just to make sure they're not full of grease. Anyway, just a quick hint. Remove the outer bearing and put it on a clean piece of paper towel, so that's removed. Then we proceeded to pull the hub and rotor assembly off. Here's the spindle, and you can see this is the brake caliper backing plate that attaches to the vertical link with these 4 nuts and these locking tabs. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to move this inside to a workbench, and we're going to remove that inner bearing, and we're going to clean up this outer bearing, and we'll show you how to do that. So there's the seal. There's a little piece of felt on the inside and the bearing on the inside of that. Normally what I do is I just pry that grease seal up and remove the bearing. What we're going to do is soak them in a little bit of, this is actually gasoline. We'll soak them in some gasoline. We'll throw the outer bearing in the gasoline. And what we're going to do is we're going to clean all the little grease off of it. And then we're going to blow it dry with a blowgun, and then we're going to repack it with grease. So I'm going to pull that seal off, and we'll get that bearing out. Carefully pried the seal up, and I'll just pop it off here. And you can see the felt is on the inside. You just set that aside, and that gives you access to your inner bearing. So we're going to pull that out, and we're going to throw that in the solvent as well. And we're going to clean up this surface, and we're going to clean up some of the old grease in there, and we're going to throw some new grease in, and we're going to clean those bearings up and repack them. Do an inspection of that inner bearing surface to make sure it's not pitted or corroded or rusted or bluing. This one looks pretty good. If it is any of the previous, you got to replace it. If this looks to be okay, we're just going to go back with a clean bearing, clean repacked bearing. We're going to check the other side as well for wear, and we should be good to go. So I've got the bearings cleaned up and inspected. They look fine. Just make sure that they roll fine. They're not noisy. Make sure there's no rust or pitting on them as well. What I've done is I've just, like I said, soaked them in solvent. We've blown them out with an air gun. We've dried them off so they're nice and dry, so now we're going to pack them. So I won't be able to show you how to pack these properly, but basically what you want to do is you want to force grease into the crevices by putting a dollop of grease on the palm of your hand and then sort of pushing the bearing across the grease and pushing the grease in to the bearing. So that's what we're going to do. Okay, both bearings have been packed and the grease seal has been put on the back of the hub, so we're going to put it back on the car. And we'll just be careful, obviously, when we put this back on the spindle that we don't pop that front bearing out. Just sort of keep your thumbs on it just to keep it in place when you're pushing it onto the spindle. All right, see you when we get back on the car. I should mention also, before you put this back on the car, have a look at your spindle just to make sure it looks normal, make sure there's no bluing, make sure there's no scoring from some heat. If everything looks good, go ahead and reassemble on the stub axle. If it doesn't look good, then you may want to consider replacing the stub axle. You can either go with a stock option or there's an uprated option for the stub axle. Anyway, we're going to install this back on the car. So we've got our torque wrench, and the manual calls to snug this castle nut down to 10 foot-pounds. And then you're going to turn it back 1.5 to 2 flats to fit the cotter pins. So that's what we're going to do. We've got the torque wrench set to 10 pounds. We're going to snug that down and then just move it back until we can hit the cotter pin. Okay guys, we're complete. The cotter pin's in. Castle nut is torqued down, capped back on, and we'll just fill that with a little bit of grease to keep the dirt out. You can put a little cap on there if you wanted to. Anyway, next we'll do is we'll change gloves out and we'll start working on those brake pads. So first thing I got to do to get these pads out, and actually these pads are in pretty good shape. I'm going to change them out anyway. I think they have about 5 years on these pads. There's probably about 25,000 miles on them, but I'm going to change them out. Anyway, there are some very tiny pins here that need to come out to release this little keeper rod that goes through both brake pads. So what we're going to do is we're going to push that pin out. Be careful you don't lose them. You're going to need them. So I know they're hard to see, but they are there. Apparently need those pliers, and we'll push them right out. So here's the components, guys. You can see that little split pin. And then there's the guide pin for the brake pads. This is the shim that goes on the back of the brake pad itself, and then the brake pad. All right, so those are the components. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the pins and the keepers and these little shim plates. I don't think we're going to reuse, but I'll tell you why in a minute. But we're going to get those over to the table, and we're going to get those cleaned up. Okay, guys, here are the components all cleaned up. Here are the slide pins cleaned. Here are those little pins, the keeper pins for the slide pins. These are the anti-squeal shims that go behind the brake pads. Now, I'm not going to use these on this set of brake pads. I'm using this classic gold set, and they have this coating on the back of the pad. You can see the old pad versus the new pad. I'm hoping that this works. If it doesn't, I can always go back and put the anti-squeal shims in, but we'll go without for now, and we may be going back with these later, so we'll be keeping these. Anyway, next thing to do is to go back to the car. All we're going to do is we're going to push the calipers back in as far, or push the pistons for the calipers back as far as they'll go, so I can fit the new pads in. And just what I do with that is I just use a C-clamp, and maybe we'll take a picture. So we're just going to try to push those pistons back a little bit so we get a little bit more clearance to get the new pads in. And what I've got is just a C-clamp that we're just going to basically put here, and we're just going to tighten it until the piston goes back into the body. Okay, the last thing I do, guys, is with my ultra slick brake lubricant, I lubricate these pins with a little bit of this with a Q-tip, and so that's the last step I do before I actually put it back on the rotor. Alright, so I'm going to do that now. And we're going to spread the pads, and we're going to drop it down onto the rotor. Okay, the calipers are back on in place, and we've got the torque wrench in hand again, and manual calls for the caliper to backing plate torque specs at 50 to 55 pounds. I like these to be on here pretty tight, so I'm going to go 55. So here we go. A few fingerprints on the rotor where I've touched it with my gloves. So what I've got here is a water-based degreaser. So we're just going to hit the front and the back of this with a degreaser and just dry it off with paper towels. While I was in there, guys, I took the opportunity to grease the upper ball joint and the lower ball joint. So just going to clean that excess grease off, and we're going to start to button it up. A lot of brake dust on the inside of this rim, so what we're going to do is we're going to give it a quick wipe down, and we're going to wax the inside. before we put it back on. Some of the wax will help the brake dust from sticking in the future. Okay, wheel's back on. We've just got it tightened loosely. We'll get it back on the ground and we'll torque the wheel nuts, and then we're ready to go to the next step. And we'll talk about that a bit more once I get the car back on the ground. Okay guys, last thing we've got to do is we've got to make sure that we bed in the brake pads according to this documentation from Classic Gold. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a car for a spin. We're going to follow the directions on this little flyer, and we'll make sure that we get them bedded in properly. That's it guys. Have fun.